Okay, so part 4. Um, that was identity by descent. Inbreeding has consequences, as we know, called inbreeding depression, where these are decreases in fitness that result from recessive deleterious alleles, increasing in, well, okay, let me rephrase. We have, okay. With inbreeding, we get greater homozygosity. What this means is that more individuals are homozygous than normal. And so when we have frequency of big A is normally p squared. We actually get more than usual, and that's defined by F. And this is actually 1/2 F. And then the frequency of heterozygotes decreases, also, 2PQ, based on the inbreeding coefficient. And likewise, the frequency of recessive homozygotes increases to the same degree. All right, so F is the probability that two alleles are identical by descent, and it is also the degree to which we expect homozygosity to increase and heterozygosity to decrease. Now, one of the consequences of an increase in homozygosity is that deleterious alleles end up coming together as homozygotes. So we have a greater frequency of homozygosity for recessive deleterious alleles. And this is what causes the inbreeding depression. Now, one study looked at inbreeding depression, measured the inbreeding coefficient in a group of Japanese children who were inbred. And they found that IQ dropped 6 points for every 10% increase in the inbreeding coefficient. Children of first cousins have a 40% increase in mortality rate than children of unrelated people. And first cousin marriages are not super unusual in many cultures, but they still can have pretty dire consequences. And then finally, you can intentionally inbreed individuals in the lab to try to understand inbreeding depression and the consequences of inbreeding, and this was done in mice. They then released these mice into the wild and found that the inbred mice were had 56% lower survival than outbred mice. So inbreeding is a problem, and it is basically an explanation for why we're not supposed to marry our brothers and sisters. Okay, let's talk about these other evolutionary forces. So, inbreeding depression is also okay, let me back up. So, some species in some populations operate just fine under inbreeding. I mentioned a few lectures ago that apparently in ancient Egypt, around the time of Cleopatra, Egypt was ruled by the Ptolemies, which originated from Greece, when they started this tradition of brother-sister marriages where brother and sister would marry and then they'd rule Egypt together. And this was done for generations, and they seemed to be okay, other than habitually killing each other. But outbred people do that too. And not only was this commonly done in the royal family, it was commonly done among the commoners also. And there is no archaeological evidence of ill effects, which doesn't mean that they weren't there, but it can happen without ill effects. And one reason for this is that deleterious alleles get purged from the population. Individuals die, and then the population can inbreed as much as they want without any ill effects. There are a number of inbreeding species in nature, one of which is this garden slug, which is many plants, most plants, and many animals are hermaphroditic, and they can self-fertilize, one of which is this hermaphroditic slug, and they tend to be more inbred, and they seem to be doing just fine. So, okay. Mutation. So, let's say we start out in a population with a single allele. We don't have any variation at this particular locus. Then we get mutation, forward mutation, to produce this second allele. At the same time, there's a back mutation rate, a reverse mutation rate. And at first, the frequency of forward mutations is greater than the frequency of reverse mutations, which is normal. That's mutation rates are generally faster for forward mutations than reverse mutations. Eventually, the population reaches an equilibrium where the rate of forward mutation equals the rate of reverse mutation, and these allele frequencies stabilize. So mutation rate is a function of forward mutations, is a function of reverse mutations. And this relationship can also be viewed graphically, where this is the allele frequency of the first allele, which we're calling P. And over a number of generations, it starts out as the only allele, so its frequency is 1. The second allele comes along, and they converge on some equilibrium allele frequency. Okay. So, migration. So migration is fairly intuitive. You can have two different populations with different allele frequencies. If some of these individuals migrate into this population, you now have a change in allele frequencies. So migration can be an evolutionary force for changing allele frequencies within a population. Drift. All right, so genetic drift is about sampling. So let's say we have a population with equal allele frequencies of, in this case, the white and the green allele. Let's say out of this bag, that's our gene pool, we're picking 10 alleles. And we are going to get some what we call error or stochasticity, which is basically sort of random processes, often due to sample. Well, it's kind of as a randomness. So you might by chance draw 7 white alleles and 3 green alleles, and then your gene pool frequencies in the next generation are going to be 70-30. Then you might by chance draw 4 and 6 again. So you're basically getting changes in allele frequency from one generation to the next based only on sampling. And by sampling, we mean reproduction. So in a whole population, there may be only a few individuals that are reproducing. and you get some random sampling error depending on whose happens to be in that reproducing group. So over time, you will eventually are likely to get, due to sampling errors, sometime you might just draw 10 of all one color, and then all of a sudden you've lost the green allele from that population and the white allele has gone to fixation. So fixation means that there's 100% of one allele. The other has been lost from the population. Okay? That's genetic drift. Genetic drift is going to be much stronger in small populations than large populations. Envision a bag of marbles with 10,000 alleles and a bag of marbles with 20 alleles. The chances of drawing, and say 50% of those individuals get to mate every generation, the chances of drawing 5,000 alleles, you're more likely to reflect the existing allele frequencies. If you're choosing 10 alleles out of 20, you're more likely to have more stochasticity, more sampling error in that, and greater fluctuations in allele frequency. So what can happen due to drift is that small populations can become fixed for one allele or the other. And so what this is showing is data from an experiment done in the lab for 107 populations of Drosophila melanogaster. They looked at the frequencies over time, how they changed for 2 alleles from a single locus. And what they found, generally the populations were on average around 0.5 frequency for one of these alleles. Over time, a lot of the populations became fixed for this allele, and a lot of the populations lost that allele altogether. Now this process is very random, so that if you have 5 populations, whether or not you start at a 0.5 frequency, whether or not that allele gets fixed or whether or not it gets lost is totally random. Okay, so one consequence of genetic drift is that populations can diverge genetically over time. Without selection, they can just kind of get different because allele frequencies are changing in different ways because it's random. Genetic drift is also a big concern for species of conservation, endangered species, because they, by definition, have small populations. So their stochasticity and their sampling error is much greater. You can get population loss, fixation of alleles much more easily in small populations, and this is compounded by higher rates of inbreeding. Okay, effective population size is something that we talk about in population genetics, and it is designated by N sub E, and it is the number of breeding individuals. Because up until this point, we've been talking about population sizes by the total number of individuals, but really it's the number of individuals that breed that matter. Big population, maybe only a few individuals are breeding, and that's the population size that we're most interested in. Finally, natural selection can play a big role. Natural selection is what happens when individuals like this lizard adapt to their background and evolve cryptic coloration to remain hidden. And one big thing about natural selection can obviously change allele frequencies over time and do so in a way that decreases genetic variation. So natural selection is also the only evolutionary process here that, that promotes adaptation. Okay,